Brilliant. Thank you so much, and sorry for the delay. So today I wanted to do, my background is sociology and ethics, so I don't have a technical background. And today I wanted to take a more of a zoomed out approach to thinking about how are the environmental impacts of research being currently addressed in the research ecosystem. So as you just heard, Charlotte talked about why we are here and what we should be doing. I'm going to be talking about what is happening at the moment, and then later on, following through, later this morning and this afternoon, we'll be talking about what we can do personally in moving forward. So I think it's really important, and Charlotte highlighted it. So with these 15 minutes, one of the main take-home messages I want to get across is that we can't make significant change unless we have a shared understanding of practice. So your researchers, you just do your own research, but you work within a broader research ecosystem that includes not just funding bodies, higher education institutions, but also journals, the suppliers of materials that you use, policymakers, oversight bodies, industry. And it's really imperative that everybody shares the same understanding. To give you a couple of examples of what happens when this shared understanding breaks down, a few years ago I was doing some interviews with population health scientists that were using AI in their research about ethics, backgrounders in ethics. And I said to them, you know, how do you think about ethics in your work? And they said, well, we struggle to think about ethics because once we've trained our AI models, we want to, you know, test them out. We want to look at issues of equity and discrimination and fairness. But actually, the funding bodies who call for ethical AI research are more interested in new innovative grants. And I'm sure this is something that you guys are very much familiar with. So for them, it was like, we need to drop that project and go on to the next best thing because we need to run after the money. And that's an example of where if you have something out of equilibrium, if you don't have that shared practice, that shared understanding of what it means to be ethical in that case, then you have a breakdown. Another example more relevant to environmental sustainability is if you're a researcher, you're thinking about where to store your data, you identify a data center that is, you know, powered by renewable energy, thinks about human labor and how to treat their workforce, but it costs more to store your data there than it would do elsewhere. And potentially you have funding bodies only giving you a certain amount of money to store your data somewhere. That's where, and they're not prepared to potentially go the extra mile. That's where you would have potentially another issue that's related to shared understanding, because you, as researchers, become tied into trying to make the environmentally correct choice, but can't do so because of other barriers that are relevant to the research ecosystem. So what's happening so far across the research ecosystem? Well, we have this huge rise in, and I'm sure you might be aware of it, of researchers from the bottom up trying to make, and we are part of that, trying to make changes from the bottom up. And this has been particularly around wet lab laboratories. So we have symposia, you might have seen events or networks that you can sign up to. And Martin, for example, will be talking to you a little bit later about LEAF, which is an accreditation system for wet labs where you can get a bronze, silver or gold award depending on how environmentally sustainable your lab is. So there's a lot of work that's happening bottom up. In the more digital sector, you'll see that a whole range of disciplines, including the health sciences, we have both Loic and Nick will be talking to you a little bit later about the work that they've done around health and digital and assessing the carbon and emissions associated with that, but also astronomy, physics, machine learning. Everybody's trying to kind of get together, measure the carbon emissions associated with, for example, training AI models or AI inference or, running various forms of analyses. And this is all happening bottom up, and you'll find these in various journal articles in the literature. When I conducted interviews with researchers that work specifically in the health arena and specifically with data-driven technologies or methodologies, they also spoke about this need to want to be responsible. But one of the issues that they had when I spoke to them was how to reconcile these perceived responsibilities that Charlotte spoke about in practice. And this was because so much of their data was under institutional control, right? So it's the institution that manages that data, manages the storage of that data, and manages the electricity supply related to the analyses. And so as a sociologist, I've drawn on some of the work by somebody called Donna Haraway that talks about responsibility being about the ability to respond. So you can't be responsible for something if you don't have that ability to respond. So if we look at what universities are doing, we see that they're actually, trying to get on board with the sustainability agenda. And I don't think you have to look far. You can probably look at your own institutions to see, in terms of wet labs, a lot of work is going into trying to make wet labs more sustainable. I know that we've got a really big push in my institution at King's College London, but also the University in Edinburgh and the University of Oxford, which I'm acquainted with as well, are also taking these very big steps to make their labs much more sustainable. In terms of the digital side, it's a little bit more contentious, and I'm sure Loic can probably tell you a little bit more about this, but sometimes universities are potentially less happy to be transparent about their data storage practices, the type of electricity consumption that's related to that. So there is work that needs to be done through universities about trying to access that information that researchers so desperately need, so to allow them to make choices about their own research and about their own storage practices. Also, when I was conducting the interviews and researchers talked about wanting to be responsible, what was very interesting is many of them, and I'm sure that this might resonate with many of you, said, well, you know what, if the funding bodies don't require me to do it, I'm not going to do it because I'm really busy doing many, many other things. So I do feel responsible, I want to do something, but you're going to have to kind of force me to do it first while I'm busy doing all the other things we require. So what are funding bodies doing? Well, they've also considered the environmental impacts, both of their own estates and of research more generally. So we went and spoke to funding bodies, myself and Miranda, who's sitting at the table over there, and we went and spoke to a whole range of funding bodies in the UK that are specifically focused on funding health research in the digital space. And we said, what are you doing in terms of environmental sustainability? And they spoke about many things that they were doing, many initiatives, such as collaborating across funding bodies, advocacy roles, aligning sustainability with the strategic vision of the organisation, embedding knowledge and training into the organisation per se, and thinking about how to make their estate more sustainable. But they also did talk about what they're doing in relation specifically to research. So this table here highlights some data that we pulled out, and this was last summer, and they've come leaps and bounds in the last year. So this table is already behind where we are now. But some of the types of things that funding bodies are doing in terms of being implemented is, for example, in terms of guidance and support, the NIHR has a really fantastic webpage of resources that's intended for researchers, and it's part of their carbon reduction guidelines, if you've come across these. And they're just redoing this now, and now is a really good time to kind of get in there. I've spoken to them about getting in some guidelines there for data-driven researchers. The MRC established in 2021 the Green Group as a pilot scheme to explore environmental ambitions of the organisation, and the MRC now has come much, much further in terms of its investment in thinking through the environmental sustainability of research. They're set up as sustainability leads. They have funded some pilot projects that are promoting practical solutions to reducing the environmental impacts of health research, and in fact this workshop is part of a pilot project that Charlotte was PI on. The Wellcome, thank you very much, and Talia sitting at the back there, has commissioned work to explore current tools that can measure the environmental impacts of health research, and Talia's talking to you guys after I speak now, so you can hear more about that. In terms of assessment criteria, which I suppose you guys are probably most interested in, there's movement to start thinking about how we can assess environmental sustainability in funding body applications. So the BBSRC has included a sustainability criteria in one funding call out so far. It was unweighted, but the panel used it to distinguish between quite closely ranked proposals. NERC has run a pilot that requires researchers to consider the environmental impact of their research. Wellcome asked for carbon calculations within many of their applications, and the Health Foundation have asked applicants if they have an environmental policy, and also to outline anticipated environmental impact proposals. And this isn't an assessed criterion as yet, but the data is being used to inform any future assessed criterion. At the European level, because I know we can now apply to Horizon 2020, the next one after 2020 again, the European Commission are getting quite stringent with this as well. Some of their fellowships require now for you to have an environmental impact assessment as part of any funding proposal. So it is moving in the right direction. The UKRI has developed a concordat for the environmental sustainability of research and innovation and practice. So they're trying to bring together research funding bodies, higher education institutions, and researchers with a concordat to say, we are going to take this seriously. This was open for consultation, which has now closed, but it hasn't been published widely yet. It is very soft, which is a real shame. There's a lot of talk about encouraging as opposed to actually doing, but it is nice to see that the sector is moving in the right direction. The UKRI are also taking steps to make their digital research infrastructure net zero, and Miranda will be talking more about that later on this morning. So they had a scoping project to explore the recommendations of how we can move towards this net zero digital research infrastructure. And when I say digital research infrastructure, if you are funded by the UKRI, then where your data is stored is part of their digital research infrastructure. So you're part of that move towards net zero. So as a sociologist, I suppose I come back to, are these changes going to be enough? Like, even if we all make these changes, will we achieve what we set out to achieve? And I want to just draw your attention to something that you may have come across, which is called the rebound effect. Many of the drives, the initiatives to improve the sustainability of data-driven health research, or data-driven research more generally, digital technologies more generally, is around efficiency. So you may hear a lot of talk of, we need to make our practices more efficient because then we can reduce the energy consumption and also the resource consumption, because efficiency means we have smaller digital devices, so we're using less resources and less energy. So one of the main concerns with this is that it doesn't account for the fact that behavior change happens when things become more efficient. So if we don't regulate the behavior change, the likelihood is that the behavior change will lead to smaller energy savings than we would have thought should have come from an increase in efficiency, and in worst case backfire so that we increase consumption. So a really kind of household example of this is traffic. So building roads to increase the efficiency of traffic leads to more roads on the road, more cars on the road, and I'm old enough to have seen this with the M25 that was built to ease the traffic efficiency in London, which is now basically at gridlock most of the time. And that's because we didn't put any regulations in terms of how many cars should be manufactured once we'd made something more efficient. Another example is one of my AI researchers when I said, what would you do if your hardware became more efficient? And he said, I will run greater and more energy intensive algorithms. So it really speaks to this fact that while we can make change at an individual level, think about energy efficiency. Energy efficiency will not be enough, and energy efficiency is more complicated because we also need to consider hardware efficiency and carbon emissions. But does that mean we should do nothing? No, it means that we should work even harder. We need bottom-up and top-down approaches. We've just done a sociological review of the animal research ethics literature. So if you're old enough to know, prior to kind of like the 1970s, 1980s, there was no kind of real research ethics in the animal ethics literature. We didn't treat animals very well. And that animal research ethics became institutionalized. So we expanded our moral gaze from humans to animals. So we've been exploring this to see, well, how can we explore it further, right, to sustainability, to the environment? And what we found was it wasn't a change in ethics that was so important in the drive for change, but it was public outcry, it was advocacy groups, and it was researchers that were all required to make these changes and make them institutional. So just as it's important to have regulation top down, we need regulation, we need bottom up movement as well. And this is just from an article that we've, some collaborators from actually this project and I have put together. There are many, it's just basically showing that there are many scales and there are many points that we have to intersect to make research more environmentally friendly. And there is a role, there is agency for individuals such as yourself to start thinking about how we can make that part more, right at the bottom of the graph, how you can make your research more efficient. And that needs to be layered with that shared understanding as you go up to more of the systematic and systemic level. So on a final note, remember this is really, really exciting. So if you know Mike Berners-Lee, or maybe not personally, he wrote There Is No Planet B. He's a collaborator on one of the grants that we were working on, and he always says, right, we need constraints to be creative. And creativity is what makes us good researchers. So we shouldn't be shy of being constrained in some way, but we should see it as an opportunity to thrive as researchers, to be creative, and to move to a co-alignment of health and sustainability goals. Thank you very much.